House of the Dragon Season 1 completely subverted my expectations, and I don't mean this from a plot perspective, but I genuinely didn't think it would be that good after I saw the first few trailers. But I decided to watch it with an open mind, since the showrunners were not David and Dan, and I'm happy to say, this is one of my favorite television seasons ever. If I had to rate the season, I would give it a 9 out of 10. I actually would have given it a 10, but it has a few issues and they're too significant to ignore, so I'm going to talk about those at the end. But first, let's focus on the positives. Every episode of Season 1 is thematically packed without it seeming forced. Some episodes feel almost self-contained to the point that if you recommended one of them to a random person who's never watched Game of Thrones or seen any previous House of the Dragon episodes, they would probably like it. All of the episodes have a major subplot. The first episode focusing on Emma's pregnancy, the second on Daemon's defiance, the third on Rhaenyra's loneliness, the fourth on her coming of age, the fifth on Kristen's honor, and so on. My favorite episodes were definitely 8 and 10, but 1, 3, 4, and 7 are all very good as well. I think that episodes 5, 6, and 9 are a bit worse than all the others because they each have a major flaw. However, they're still good episodes overall and I enjoyed them. House of the Dragon is not carried by action, but rather by characters, and the characters are fantastic. My favorite character is probably Viserys, but Rhaenyra is obviously the most important character to the first season. In major contrast to Season 2, every scene with Rhaenyra is interesting, and we see her go from a carefree and reckless teenager to a flawed adult, but a great mother. And what Rhaenyra goes through because of the succession is tragic. We see that her life would have been much easier if she was just born a man. I'll never be able to directly relate to Rhaenyra's struggles, but they were still very impactful. My favorite Rhaenyra moments in Season 1 are the hunt in Episode 3, her journey through Flea Bottom in Episode 4, the long take of Rhaenyra ascending the steps in Episode 6, and every single scene in Episode 10. Daemon is also fantastic in Season 1. I could talk about him for a while, but it'll be a bit more brief here. Daemon this season is meant to be more of a confusing mystery than a character we can fully relate to or understand. He's completely insane, and he's a loose cannon that you just can't predict, and to me, that's why the Season 2 Harrenhal plot is necessary. Daemon's best scenes are his confrontation with Viserys in Episode 1, his battle in the Stepstones in Episode 3, his confrontation with Viserys in Episode 4, his confrontation with Viserys in Episode 7, him helping Viserys up the steps in Episode 8, there's sort of a pattern here, and his conversation with Rhaenyra in Episode 10. Alicent was actually the character I was most interested in going into this show. Until around Episode 9, I had not read Fire and Blood, but I had heard all the Cersei comparisons, and I was a little worried her character would feel like a copy. However, I'm happy to say she's completely different from that, and very much her own person. Alicent is the core of some of the best family dynamics I've seen in television, and because of the groundwork in Season 1, her kids become insanely good characters in Season 2. Alicent uses duty and honor as a weapon against Rhaenyra, and this is the emotional core of the series. It's worth saying though, Alicent and Rhaenyra's relationship is not really book accurate, as in the books, Alicent is more of an older stepmother figure, but I find both versions interesting in their own ways. Viserys is the best character in this show. He's probably one of my favorite characters in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, books included. And that's because of his characterization in the show, not in Fire and Blood. Viserys having to live with the fact that he sacrificed his wife to a C-section to save a child that died soon after, killing them both, is an insane point of character conflict to start a show with, and this decision strains his relationship with every character in the show as a result. Throughout the season, Viserys is also slowly being killed by the Iron Throne itself, as he contracts what appears to be leprosy after cutting himself on it. In every episode, we see Viserys degrade just a little bit more, marking the passage of time in a season full of time skips. Again, I hadn't read Fire and Blood until the last couple episodes of Season 1, so when I saw Viserys alive in Episode 6, I was pretty shocked. Viserys is probably my favorite execution of the king archetype in fantasy. Paddy Considine's performance is legendary, and this guy didn't even get nominated for an Emmy, an absolute travesty, but Emmys don't matter anyways, I guess. The nearly 3-minute long scene of Viserys struggling to get up the Iron Throne in Episode 8 is seriously one of the best scenes I've ever seen in anything, and for that alone, this season deserves to be mentioned with the greats. However, this does not mean that this season is flawless. Firstly, I think that Kristen should have faced more consequences for what he did in Episode 5. I know that he's a Kingsguard member. You can compare it to police brutality maybe, saying how he got away with it just because he was a Kingsguard, but it's still a little bit ridiculous. And in the book, Kristen kills Joffrey in a tournament, and there's some plausible deniability there. Though I guess that, like, it is difficult and budget consuming to create another tournament. Although I feel like they could have done that with the set that they used for episode 1, so I don't know, there's some arguments both ways here. But what probably hurt the show even more is how rushed episode 6 is. And that's because Rhaenyra and Daemon's relationships with Harwin and Laena respectively were barely explored, so their eventual deaths do not really hit. And even worse than that is the bursting of the dragon pit scene in episode 9. I'm sorry, but this scene did not work the way that the writers intended it, and it's pretty infamous at this point. Rhaenys bursting out of the dragon pit, killing probably hundreds of innocents just to not burn all of the Greens alive makes no sense, and if you've seen season 2, it makes even less sense because you know what happens as a result of this. And it's a scene that was written in order to give Rhaenys a major character moment, but it was not earned, and Rhaenys would have been a better character if the scene did not happen. Lastly, I'm not the biggest fan of the way that the Song of Ice and Fire is used in this show. In season 2, this has worse effects than in season 1, as we see that it sort of whitewashes Rhaenyra's motivations down the line. But also, even the idea of the Song of Ice and Fire being Aegon's dream feels a little bit too straightforward, and we're never gonna get to explore it more than that surface level interpretation in the show, as far as I can understand. George R. R. Martin has talked about the ways that he handles prophecy, and it's never so straightforward as it is presented here. I just don't really think that it needed to be included, and the character motivations could have had nothing to do with the coming White Walkers, and that would have been completely fine and interesting. I think that the showrunners were focused on making sure that the show was interpreted as a prequel to Game of Thrones, but really it's just another story that takes place in the same world, even if it centers around the Iron Throne. Anyways, I've already talked about the issues that this caused down the line in my previous video, so I'm going to stop here with that. But in any case, season 1 is still really good despite these flaws. It was a really good weekly experience, and I watched every episode of it with friends, which was a lot of fun. I know that season 2 didn't hit the same way for a lot of people, so I hope season 3 is going to recapture some of that. Thanks for watching, and if you feel like it, then leave some feedback or like or even subscribe.